Have you ever noticed how some people react when they are hurt? They do not argue. They do not raise their voice. Instead, something much quieter happens. They go silent. But it is not the kind of silence that comes from calmness or peace. It is not the silence of indifference. It feels like someone is slowly stepping away from the room, even though they are still standing right in front of you. Their words become shorter and clipped. Their eyes look away more often, avoiding direct contact. Their body turns slightly inward, as if they are trying to fold into themselves. And then the conversation continues, but somehow they are no longer truly part of it. From the outside, this behavior can be incredibly confusing to witness. People often interpret this sudden silence in the worst possible ways. They interpret it as coldness. They view it as stubbornness. They might even see it as arrogance or intentional uncooperativeness. But what most people do not see is what is actually happening beneath that quiet moment. Because for many of these individuals, silence is not a lack of feeling. It is the exact opposite. Words are there, forming and dissolving at the exact same time. That instinct whispers a simple command: step back. Not because they want distance, but because in that highly charged moment, distance feels safer than being misunderstood again. What looks like cold indifference from the outside is often someone trying very hard to protect a profoundly sensitive inner world. Psychology has a specific name for this behavioral pattern. It is called emotional withdrawal. It is a coping response that happens when someone feels emotionally overwhelmed or fundamentally unsafe in a situation. At first glance, emotional withdrawal looks like avoidance. It looks like someone is simply refusing to deal with the conversation or the conflict at hand. But emotional withdrawal usually is not about refusing to engage. It is about protecting oneself from emotional harm. When a person experiences stress or criticism or conflict, the brain immediately evaluates the situation. Not physical danger, but emotional danger. The risk of being judged. The risk of being misunderstood. The risk of being dismissed or hurt all over again. So instead of moving toward the conflict, their nervous system moves them away from it. Silence becomes a shield. Most individuals who rely on emotional withdrawal have actually tried the opposite at some point in their lives. They tried explaining their feelings. They tried expressing exactly what hurt them. They tried asking desperately to be understood. But those attempts did not go the way they hoped. Maybe their words were twisted to mean something completely different. Maybe no one really listened to them at all. Over time, the brain learns from these painful experiences. It begins forming a quiet, deeply ingrained conclusion. Speaking up does not always make things better. In fact, sometimes speaking up makes things so much worse. So gradually the mind adopts an entirely different strategy. A strategy that feels more predictable and far less painful. Instead of risking another painful misunderstanding, it becomes easier to just step back emotionally. And eventually, silence stops being a temporary reaction. It becomes a familiar psychological pattern. A safe house they retreat to whenever the world feels too loud. For many people who withdraw into silence, there was a moment or a series of moments when something quietly shifted inside them. It usually does not happen all at once. At first, they do what most people naturally do when they feel hurt. They try to say what bothered them, what confused them, or what felt unfair. They might say things like, "That really hurt me," or "I did not mean it that way." In those early moments, they are still holding on to the hope of being understood. Sometimes they are told they are simply overreacting. Sometimes their words are interrupted or turned against them like weapons. After enough experiences, something subtle begins to change in the architecture of their mind. The brain starts recognizing a pattern of pain. Every attempt to explain seems to lead to the same tragic result: more tension, misunderstanding, and emotional exhaustion. Eventually, a quiet conclusion forms, not a conscious decision but a protective instinct. If speaking leads to pain, silence must be safer. Instead of defending themselves, they step back. Instead of sharing their feelings, they keep them inside. Silence starts to feel safer. It avoids arguments before they begin and the risk of saying the wrong thing. Silence avoids the deeply painful feeling of being misunderstood yet again. From the outside, this change can be almost invisible. But internally, something monumental has happened. A protective rule has quietly taken root. And over time, that rule becomes something the mind follows automatically. For many, this pattern of emotional withdrawal doesn't begin in adulthood. It often starts earlier, during childhood. Children naturally communicate their feelings. When sad, they cry. When confused, they ask endless questions. Imagine a child saying, "That hurt my feelings." If the response is, "You're being too sensitive," or "Stop making a big deal out of nothing," the child learns a lesson. Psychologists describe this as emotional invalidation. When this happens repeatedly during childhood, the child's developing mind begins to adapt for survival. Children depend entirely on caregivers for emotional safety. Instead of expressing sadness, they learn to hold it in. Instead of explaining hurt, they learn to stay quiet. Instead of asking to be understood, they try to handle the heavy weight of their emotions alone. At first, this silence is simply a way to avoid being criticized or dismissed. But over time, it becomes much deeper. It becomes a habit. The child grows into an adult who may struggle profoundly to express emotions. Not because they don't have them, but because their nervous system has learned that showing those emotions leads to pain. So even years later, when surrounded by different people and new relationships, that early lesson still echoes quietly. It is safer to stay quiet than to risk being misunderstood again. One of the biggest misunderstandings about people who go quiet when hurt is the assumption that nothing is happening inside. From the outside, their silence can look completely empty. It looks as if they have nothing to say. But the reality is usually the exact opposite. Inside their mind, there is an intense, overwhelming amount of activity. They replay the conversation again and again, examining every single detail. They analyze the tone of voice. They dissect the choice of words. They notice small expressions that others might overlook entirely. They ask themselves quiet, panicked questions. Did I misunderstand something? Did I say the wrong thing? Would explaining my side make things better, or would it just make everything worse? While all this rapid calculation is happening internally, another part of their mind regulates raw emotions. The hurt, the frustration, the confusion. So they begin doing what they've learned to do over a lifetime. They process everything privately. Instead of speaking thoughts aloud, they have long, exhausted conversations with themselves. They attempt to make sense of the situation internally. They organize feelings and explanations that may never be shared. Ironically, many understand their own emotions perfectly well. They can describe exactly what they feel if they write it down. But in the moment, when words are expected, when someone is waiting for a response, something shifts. The thoughts remain clear inside their mind, yet somehow the voice that could express them simply stays quiet. Many people who experience this kind of emotional withdrawal describe a very specific and confusing sensation. When they try to speak during emotionally tense moments, they feel blocked. The thoughts are there. The explanations are there. Sometimes they even know exactly the words they want to say. But when the moment comes to actually speak, something in their physical body seems to stop them. Their throat tightens, their chest feels incredibly heavy. Their mind suddenly goes blank. As if the connection has been severed. It can feel as if the words are trapped somewhere, between the mind and the mouth, unable to move forward. To someone watching, it might look like hesitation, or a stubborn unwillingness to respond. But internally, the experience can feel surprisingly physical. Psychology and neuroscience offer a fascinating explanation for this reaction. When a person perceives emotional conflict as a profound threat, the nervous system can activate a protective survival response. Most people are familiar with fight or flight, the instinct to confront danger or run away from it. But there is another response that often goes completely unnoticed. The freeze response. In a freeze response, the body temporarily shuts down expressive action. Speech slows down, muscles tense up, and the mind becomes quiet or overwhelmed. It is the body's biological way of pausing the situation, reducing the chance of making a dangerous moment worse. For people who learned early in life that emotional expression could lead to criticism, conflict, or rejection, this freeze response becomes triggered easily. It becomes closely tied to the very moments when they most need to speak about their feelings. So when they go silent, it is not always a conscious, calculated choice. Sometimes their nervous system has already made the decision for them. And the silence that follows is simply the body trying desperately to protect itself. Over time, when someone repeatedly withdraws during emotional moments, a deeper, more permanent pattern begins to form. They start learning how to handle absolutely everything on their own. Instead of reaching out, they turn inward. Instead of explaining what hurts them, they process the wound privately. Little by little, they develop a habit of managing their entire emotional life in absolute silence. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a form of internal emotional regulation. It is the ability to process distress internally rather than seeking comfort or resolution through conversation with others. On the surface, this can look like incredible strength. These individuals often appear completely calm during conflicts. They rarely create dramatic scenes and they seldom demand emotional reassurance from anyone. Many people even describe them as mature, independent, or highly emotionally stable. But what others do not see is the quiet, crushing weight behind that independence. Every disappointment, every misunderstanding, every painful moment gets carried inside instead of being shared. Instead of releasing those emotions through conversation, they absorb them. They try to make sense of the darkness completely alone. At first, this strategy may actually feel incredibly effective. Handling things alone avoids arguments. It avoids uncomfortable, vulnerable explanations. It prevents others from dismissing their feelings ever again. But over the years, this habit slowly creates a profound emotional isolation. When someone becomes used to processing everything privately, asking for support starts to feel entirely unfamiliar. It feels uncomfortable. Sharing vulnerability begins to feel unnatural, as if it breaks a sacred rule they have followed for most of their life. So they continue doing what they have always done. They stay quiet, they think deeply, and they carry their emotional world within themselves. Often they do this without realizing how incredibly heavy that world has quietly become. One of the most painful parts of this entire pattern is the tragic paradox it creates. People who withdraw emotionally are almost never trying to push others away. In fact, many of them want connection just as deeply as anyone else. They want to feel understood. They want someone who can truly see what they are feeling without judging or dismissing it. But the very strategy they learn to protect themselves quietly works against that deep desire. When they feel hurt, they go silent. When something bothers them, they keep it buried inside. When misunderstandings happen, they withdraw instead of offering an explanation. From their perspective, this feels like necessary self-protection. Silence prevents conflict. Silence prevents saying something that could make the fragile situation worse. Silence keeps their tender emotions from being exposed to the harsh light of criticism or rejection. But from the outside, that exact same silence can look completely different to the person standing across from them. It may appear as a cold, calculated distance. It may seem like pure disinterest, emotional unavailability, or passive aggression. And this is where the heartbreaking paradox begins. The more someone withdraws to protect themselves, the more others feel completely shut out. And the more others feel shut out, the less likely they are to approach with patience or gentle curiosity. So the emotional gap between people slowly grows wider and wider. What started as a desperate way to avoid pain gradually becomes something that unintentionally creates more of it. The person who longs to feel understood ends up appearing totally unreachable. And the silence that once felt like a safe harbor becomes a towering wall, not only protecting their inner world, but isolating them from the very connection they were desperately hoping to keep. Because their reactions are so quiet, people who withdraw emotionally are constantly misunderstood. From the outside, their silence is easily interpreted in all the wrong ways. People assume they are arrogant. They assume they are intentionally uncooperative or stubborn. They may even be labeled as antisocial or emotionally cold. But these harsh labels completely miss what is actually happening beneath the surface. The truth is, many of these individuals are not lacking emotion at all. They experience emotions very deeply, often too deeply. They notice the subtle changes, the small shifts, the unspoken tension that others simply overlook. Their silence is not the absence of feeling. It is the direct result of feeling too much and not knowing whether it is safe to express it. When someone has learned through repeated past experiences that their emotions might be used against them, staying quiet feels like the only reasonable option left. So while the world sees distance, what is really happening is something deeply human. A person is simply trying to protect their vulnerable inner world from being broken again. Sometimes all that person truly needed was not the pressure to speak immediately. They just needed a space where their feelings could exist without being judged or interrupted. Healing for people who withdraw into silence rarely ever begins with pressure. It does not start when someone tells them, "You need to speak up more." It does not happen when they are asked, "Why do you not just say what you feel?" In fact, those kinds of demands usually make the silence even stronger. Real healing usually begins with something much simpler, much softer: safety. The moment someone finally experiences a conversation where they are not interrupted, where they are not corrected, and where they are not judged for how they feel, something inside them begins to change. At first, the change is incredibly small. They might share just a single sentence instead of staying completely quiet. They might try to explain one single feeling instead of hiding all of them. And when that small act of vulnerability is met with patience instead of criticism, their nervous system begins to learn a profound new lesson. Maybe speaking is not always dangerous. Maybe this time it is safe. Over time, those small moments of truly being heard can rebuild a shattered sense of trust. Trust that their emotions are actually valid. Trust that their voice truly matters. Trust that human connection does not always have to end in painful misunderstanding. And little by little, the heavy silence that once felt so necessary begins to soften. Because the truth is, silence was never really the goal. It was simply protection. They were never trying to disappear. They were simply waiting for it to be safe enough to finally be seen.